Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here. I'm back from my London jaunt, and by the time you hear this, the interview with my friends at the London Science Museum should have already been posted. I came and I saw the Clockwork treasures from China's Forbidden City exhibition and want to encourage everyone who lives in or visits London to go cop a gander. The curators and museologists at the LSM did a bang-up job with the whole exhibit, and each one of these masterpieces is shown in its own display case, and you could walk around each one and see the exquisiteness of these clocks from every angle. I've had this topic of clocks and timekeeping devices in Chinese history on my list for years, and I was thinking the other day, well, why not pull this one up from the bottom of the pile and feature it now as a kind of, complimentary episode to the interview I did with Tilly Blythe and Abby McKinnon. So here it is, and this won't be long, I promise. I spent a week in London with my son. And aside from the activities surrounding the Clockwork Treasures opening at the LSM, I pretty much spent most of my days taking in the main museums. And in the space of 4 or 5 days at the British Museum, not once but twice, the V&A, and all the galleries, I repeatedly came face to face with the genius and the follies of humankind. And in viewing the objects from the millennia before the Common Era to our time in the 21st century, I was repeatedly reminded about how far we've come and how this mass and velocity of human knowledge and artistic design has never stopped accelerating, and how all these accumulated innovations going back to all those ancient artifacts we saw have led to everything we have in our very own day. I remember a time when we'd say, what's the world going to be like in 100 years? Now I wonder, what will it be like by the end of the summer? When you look at the history of clocks and timekeeping devices, frankly speaking, all the greatest world civilizations, I don't need to say their names, we all know them, they all came up with their own precise methods of keeping time and designing devices to measure time. And they couldn't measure the number of vibrations of the cesium-133 isotope back in the time of the Aztecs and the Mayans, but even faced with that handicap, they still came out with a pretty accurate way to measure time. And this being the China History Podcast and all, we're only going to look at clocks as they developed in China. The precise measurement of time was intertwined with various aspects of daily life in ancient China. The time and the seasons influenced agriculture, governance, philosophy, and practical daily activities affecting people, the natural world, and broader affairs in Chinese society. Like in any advanced civilization, time was critical for a whole bunch of reasons, few of which matter to us in our everyday life. But to the ancients, the accuracy of time was central to so much of what mattered in society. It was an agricultural world back then, and farming was life. And once the seasons and the stars were all observed and noted, an agricultural calendar was devised that gave farmers the timetable for when to plant, when was harvest time, and all the minutiae needed to ensure everything was optimal with respect to agricultural productivity. They created gods to protect them in all the ways that gods everywhere do, and these gods all had their special days, holidays, rituals, and festivals that needed to be observed all year, every year. And these gods had no patience for their faithful who didn't do the right prayers at the right hour on the right day. Time was paramount when it came to predicting when were the most auspicious moments to beseech the gods or carry out some ritual before going to war or for anything important. Inside the palace of the kings going back to Yu the Great and right into the last Emperor Puyi's time in the 20th century, for the arrangement of official ceremonies, court sessions, the coronation or wedding of a new monarch, precision and accuracy was everything. People were put to death for getting the time wrong. As China became more and more advanced and sophisticated all those millennia ago, to put it simply, they needed to be able to measure time so that when something needed to be done on such and such a day, every year, at the same time, and facing a certain direction, it had to be right. And that was the whole raison d'etre of a clock or timekeeping device. And I thought what we'd do is look at a few of the greats in the history of Chinese clockmaking and what each of them did to advance the science and engineering of accurate and precise clocks. And in the Han, in the Tang, and ever after, as the size of the nation expanded and the borders got punched out in so many directions, the government and the military needed to always work in harmony together over great distances. And these timekeeping devices allowed for the synchronization of activities across all the regions of the Chinese Empire. In that last series on the history of Chinese medicine, I'll admit I hit you all with a tsunami of names of so many great physicians and all the names of their many magnum opuses. Well, you're getting off easy this episode. There's less than half a dozen notables who'll be mentioned, one of them from the Eastern Han, one from the Tang, a couple from the Song, and two from the Ming. The sundial is the earliest and most primitive form of timepiece known to humankind, and China's first sundials appeared during the Western Zhou. These were preceded by gnomon instruments. The gnomon, Gnomon, was that part of the sundial that consisted of a vertical shaft, column, or the like, and that was used to determine the altitude of the sun or the latitude of a position by measuring the length of its shadow cast at noon. And these were the earliest timekeeping devices in China. The next milestone in clockmaking was the clepsydra type. Clepsydra was the Greek word for water clock. And these ancient devices measured time by utilizing the regulated flow of water or mercury through a small aperture. Also in ancient Greece, a device called a water thief was employed for drawing liquids from vats that were too massive to pour. And they utilized the principles of air pressure to transport the liquid from one container to another. And this kind of outflow type clepsydra was another timekeeping device used in China as long ago as the Qing Dynasty, and certainly by the Zhou. In an outflow clepsydra, water flows out of a small hole in the opening at the bottom of a container at a constant rate, and time is measured based on the level of water remaining in the container. As time passes, the water level decreases, and the user can estimate the time by observing the remaining water level. In an inflow clepsydra, as opposed to the outflow type, water is added to a container at a constant rate, and the container normally has a steady inflow of water, and the time is measured by observing a floating indicator or a graduated scale that rises as the water level increases. And with the passage of time, using a marked scale, the position of the rising water level indicates the time. The inflow clepsydra with an indicator rod on a float has been known in China since the beginning of the Han Dynasty, early 2nd century BC, and had replaced the less accurate and more cumbersome outflow type. The inflow type water clocks remain the state-of-the-art in timekeeping for almost 2 millennia. The first mechanical timepiece in China appeared during the Han Dynasty, early 2nd century AD, and the first of China's great clock engineers was Zhang Heng, 78 to 139 AD. He was born during the golden age of the Eastern Han, during that period known as the Mingzhang Zhi, the reigns of emperors Ming and Zhang. After those two good emperors, it was all downhill for the Eastern Han for the next 114 years. Zhang Heng was an imperial astronomer who built an armillary sphere that was powered by water. He was actually a contemporary of the great astronomer, mathematician Claudius Ptolemy in Alexandria. Zhang Heng, in 117, was the first person known to have applied hydraulic motive power in the form of a water wheel and a clepsydra to rotate an armillary sphere. Now, I mentioned armillary spheres in that History of Chinese Medicine series when looking at Su Song, who we'll get to in a bit. An armillary sphere is an astronomical instrument representing the celestial sphere, and it consisted of a set of concentric rings marked with angular coordinates of objects in the sky. Zhang Heng's celestial globe was connected to a timing clepsydra from which water dripped to make the globe turn on a regular basis. And it made a complete circuit in one day. So people watching the globe indoors would be able to locate celestial bodies at different times of the day. And the armillary sphere had both an outside and an inside sphere that rotated. On the surface were carved the north and south poles, the equator, the ecliptic, which is the apparent path that the sun traces through the sky over the course of a year as observed from Earth. And it also displayed the 24 solar terms, the 24节气, the sun, the moon, and certain stars. It was quite an awesome mechanical device considering it was made in the 2nd century AD, but then again, considering the comparative genius of Chinese civilization and culture, perhaps not so amazing. Zhang Heng also invented the world's first seismometer, called a didongyi. This literally means an instrument for measuring the movements of the earth, which could discern the direction of an earthquake some 500 kilometers away. Zhang Heng is also remembered for his astronomical observations and for his extensive star catalog. In his lifetime, he documented approximately 2,500 stars. He also wrote his theories about the moon and its relationship to the sun and the nature of solar and lunar eclipses. And this was all 13, 14 centuries before Copernicus and Galileo. Zhang Heng did believe, however, that the heavens had a hard external shell and that the cosmos outside the shell was infinite in space and time. So he got it part right, I guess you could say. But in the history of Chinese clockmaking, Zhang Heng is sort of a patron saint, and his work provided the foundation for all that was to follow. The next major milestone in the history of Chinese horology concerned a Buddhist monk named Xing, who did most of his great work during the Qing Dynasty in the time of the Kaiyuan era of Emperor Xuanzong. Along with his partner Liang Lingzan, they contributed to the brilliance of that storied age in Chinese history by building a water-powered astroscope or astronomical celestial globe with a built-in mechanical time-telling structure. It was described this way, quote, "It was made in the image of the round heavens, and on it were shown the lunar mansions in their order, the equator, and the degrees of the heavenly circumference. Water flowed into scoops, turned a wheel automatically, rotating at one complete revolution in one day and night. Besides this, there were 2 rings fitted around the celestial sphere outside, having the sun and moon threaded on them, and these were made to move in circling orbit. And they made a wooden casing, the surface of which represented the horizon, since the instrument was half sunk in it. It permitted the exact determinations of the time of dawns and dusks, full and new moons, tarrying and hurrying. Moreover, there were 2 wooden jacks standing on the horizon surface, having one a bell and the other a drum in front of it, the bell being struck automatically to indicate the hours, and the drum being beaten automatically to indicate the quarters. All these motions were brought about by machinery within the casing, each depending on wheels and shafts, hooks, pins, and interlocking rods, stopping devices, and locks checking mutually." End quote. This was the first in a long tradition of Chinese astronomical clockworks. It wasn't enough simply to know the time. Tracking everything in the heavens and its relation to time on Earth was also of paramount importance. Xing and Liang Lingzan are best known for applying the earliest known escapement mechanism to a water-powered celestial globe. They were collectively credited with co-inventing the mechanized water clock, and their liquid-driven escapement mechanism was the first of its kind in the world. An escapement mechanism comprises the 2 ends of the pallet fork that alternatively lock and release the escape wheel, allowing the escape wheel to rotate in precise steps that measure the time. It's like a gatekeeper that ensures the clock or watch ticks at a consistent pace, dividing time into equal intervals. And then in the northern Song dynasty came Zhang Sixun and Su Song. Zhang Sixun came first, early in the dynasty, during the reign of the founder, Emperor Taizu. And drawing on the advances made by those I've already mentioned, he came up with a scoop-bearing driving wheel and gearing, along with 19 clock jacks to announce the sound of each passing hour. Zhang Sixun saw the limitation of using water because of that thing that water did when the temperature went below 0 degrees centigrade. And so to get around that, he used liquid mercury instead, which, though dangerous to handle, assured a smooth and continual measure of time, even during those freezing cold Kaifeng winters, as long as the temperature didn't dip below minus 38.85 degrees Celsius. Not that long after, during the reigns of Song emperors Zhezong and Huizong, came Su Song. Some of you may remember him from the episode CHP 340, History of Chinese Medicine Part 4. He was also the compiler of the illustrated classic of Materia Medica, the Bancao Tu Qing. I mentioned that this work by Su Song became the new standard in the country as far as the most authoritative and updated Materia Medica of its kind, with all its printed woodblock illustrations. Su Song, he was another in these long line of great polymaths like Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, Newton, Ibn Sina, Goethe, and Descartes. Su Song also counted among those amazing and brilliant individuals. Anyway, Su Song's greatest scientific achievements were in the fields of horology and mechanical engineering. He oversaw the construction of this Shui Yun Yixiang Tai, the water-powered armillary sphere and celestial globe tower, which was the world's first hydromechanical astronomical clock tower. This water-driven astronomical clock tower, designed and built by Su along with Han Gonglian, combined an armillary sphere, celestial globe, and mechanical timepiece. It was highly complex and made from many parts, and its massive scale was only surpassed by its precision at keeping time. Joseph Needham had said that these Chinese astronomical clocks were the direct forerunner of European astronomical clocks in the Middle Ages. There's very strong evidence that supports the notion that this clock-making technology flowed westward out of China. And this device had a massive wheel that was driven by the flow of water, with mechanical design that drove all the gears that precisely turned a celestial globe, replete with spring-driven figures to mark the hours. It was 12 meters in height. That's not quite 40 feet high. And the structure supported a giant bronze armillary sphere, these three-dimensional models of the celestial sphere. In addition to other mechanical features, Su Song's clock tower had large rotating wheels that would present painted figures holding signs displaying the date and time through these windows, and drums and gongs were installed that sounded at precise times of the day. So that was in the year 1092 that he presented this miracle and wonder to Song Emperor Zhezong. But this clock tower wasn't fated to stand for long. Even the porcelain pagoda of Nanjing stood longer. No kidding, after just 30 years, in 1126, Emperor Huizong, of course, took his eye off the ball, and the Jurchens blew into Kaifeng, and you've all heard that story enough times. The city was sacked, and Su Song's Shui Yun Yixiang Tai, this water-powered armillary sphere and celestial globe tower, was a casualty of that historic violence. It wasn't completely destroyed. The Jurchens recognized its value and carted it north to their part of Manchuria. But they were unable to put the whole thing back together, and that was despite having in their possession Su Song's meticulous diagrams and instructions. Nonetheless, the sphere was left on public display until the Mongol defeat of Song in 1279, and like so many great Chinese cultural relics, we know it existed, but its whereabouts remains unknown. I'm only mentioning the marquee figures from the history of Chinese horology. Obviously, there were many others. From the 10th to 14th centuries, innovation in China continued on unabated, and different kinds of devices were engineered that combined astronomical measurement and the mechanical recording of time. At the turn of the Yuan to the Ming, the famed calligrapher Zhan Xiyuan invented a 5-wheel device using dripping sand instead of liquids like water or mercury. He discovered that using particles of sand had certain advantages. Firstly, it made the clock more portable and simpler. Using water came with some disadvantages. It froze and it evaporated. Sand was more accurate to use over longer periods of time. Towards the end of the Ming, Zhan Xiyuan's version was improved upon by Zhou Shuxue, who introduced an improved technology that lessened the chance of sand being clogged as it passed through the orifice. By the Ming, water clocks became passé. Chinese clockmakers all saw the merits of utilizing sand instead of water, and certainly mercury. And clocks functioned along the lines of Zhang Sixun's mercury clock and Su Song's water clock. The weight of the sand acted as a power source and regulator that turned the wheel to drive the gears that drove the visible display. And then we come to the late Ming and the Wanli Emperor, who became the first ruler of China to get a look at these new European mechanical chime clocks, or zimingzhong. Jesuits Ruggieri and Ricci brought them with to China, and these devices were instantly popular with the Ming imperial court. They had first appeared in Europe in 1335 in Milan and had an accuracy of about 5 to 10 minutes per month. Ricci had first arrived in Guangzhou in 1582 and stayed in China more than 20 years. In 1598, he went to Beijing, and after waiting 3 years, he was finally granted permission to enter the Forbidden City. And once his big moment came, he presented the 2 chime clocks to the Emperor Wanli, along with a triangular prism, all of which were lost when foreigners looted the palace during the late Qing. These 2 clocks that Ricci presented to the Wanli Emperor had a profound impact on what was soon to follow. You could say all of those at the imperial court who got to see these devices for the first time really took a liking to them. There was an immediate demand for more of these zimingzhong. Besides this, there was a keen interest early on by the Chinese to learn and develop this technology. The accuracy of these clocks in the Ming was quite astounding. And it's not like today, with everyone everywhere always patenting and hiding their advanced technologies. The Jesuits freely gave this knowledge to their Chinese hosts and showed them everything, helped them build their workshops and train their technicians. Of course, they were hoping for a quid pro quo, and that in return for such generosity, there might be an embrace of their Catholic faith by their Chinese hosts. As we know, they ended up going home empty-handed in that respect. But the art and science of mechanical chime clockmaking in China spread quickly to Guangzhou, Suzhou, Nanjing, and Yangzhou. Around that same time that the Jesuits were on their mission in China, 1583, Galileo discovered the theory of vibration of the pendulum, and Huygens shortly thereafter improved on Galileo's theory in 1656 with his swaying pendulums theory. And as demand ramped up, exports to China from England soared. Guangzhou customs records showed that from Kangxi to Qianlong, 2,700 clocks from the West were purchased for tribute to the emperor. And as was mentioned in the interview with Tilly Blythe and Abby McKinnon, the good old Hoppo down in Guangzhou would eagerly seek out the finest and most opulent horological treasures and forwarded them on to the emperor with his compliments. And I saw 23 of these devices when I was in London at the Science Museum's exhibition running till June 2nd, Clockwork Treasures from China's Forbidden City. These timepieces in particular caught the imagination of the Chinese political elites, the emperor most of all. By the time of the late 17th century, Emperor Kangxi had become a most enthusiastic lover of these mechanical devices, and he called for the establishment of his very own atelier or workshop of clockmakers recruited from among the Jesuit missionaries. And this was one of many examples of how the Jesuits curried favor with the emperor's court by being useful in the knowledge they freely gave. Kangxi just loved these clocks and studied them intensely and even took them apart to try and understand the inner workings. He was the early guiding light that led to the development of chime clocks in China. His son, the Yongzheng Emperor, he also took quite a fancy to these zimingzhongs and established a clock atelier that employed foreign experts who taught local artisans the tricks of the trade. And this was the first independent workshop in the palace. This workshop was put under the supervision of the Office of Manufacturing in 1723. And in 1732, the court changed its name from the Chiming Clocks Workshop to simply the Clockwork Shop. And the heyday for clockmaking at the Forbidden City occurred under Qianlong, when more than 100 craftsmen and workers were employed, both foreign and Chinese. And after 1759, during the Qianlong era, the import of Western clocks into China really kicked into high gear. This long-reigning and zimingzhong-loving emperor was said to have in his palace 4,000 clocks and watches imported from Europe, and Qianlong even involved himself in some of the designs. By then, Guangdong Customs was sending 40 to 50 clocks per year to the imperial palace. The Hall of Clocks at the Forbidden City today has around 1,025 of them in the collection, most from Britain, and these imports led directly to the establishment of China's mechanical clock and watchmaking industry. The first, and perhaps most well-known of the experts who worked in the Forbidden City, was a Swiss Jesuit named Franz Ludwig Stadlin. He was made the royal clockmaker to the court of China, and Stadlin arrived in Beijing in 1707, and until his death 33 years later, he went on to create one masterpiece after another for the pleasure of the imperial court and other elites who could afford them. A whole generation of clockmakers in China were trained under Stadlin. The main source of the watches and automata was England, and among English craftsmen, the name James Cox stands head and shoulders above all the rest. He's mentioned in the interview with Tillian Abbey. James Cox shot to fame in 1772 by supplying Emperor Qianlong and his court with watches and automata, much as Gustave Fabergé did in the 19th century, supplying his famous Fabergé eggs to the Tsar. Many of the most renowned pieces were made by Cox and his team of artisans. There wasn't any one person who could build an entire zimingzhong on their own. Besides the intricate mechanics, there was also a need for jewelers, goldsmiths, and others who were expert in all the production steps that went into the manufacture of these devices. Common shapes of clocks were Chinese pavilions, halls, towers, and terraces. The frames were made of dark-colored hardwood, decorated with jade, ivory, gold, rare stones, and silver thread. Beyond Qianlong's reign into the 19th century, even more fantastical designs were produced with running figures, revolving flowers, miniature orchestras, and fountains spouting water. As more clockmaking workshops opened up in other areas in China, it turbocharged the budding industry. More specialized workshops were set up that produced certain components, and this entire subcontracting network and supply chain grew along with market demand. And once the century of humiliation began to set in and all the wealth of the Qing Dynasty began to go towards paying back indemnities and foreign loans, there was less money lying around that could be earmarked for luxuries such as European mechanical clocks. And not only that, as we see so often today, when foreign manufacturers bring their intellectual property and technology to China, it's only a matter of time before all the secrets are figured out, and the need to pay for costly imports soon vanishes when domestic makers produce clocks that were as good or better than the European imports. And men like James Cox saw this export market dry up in his own lifetime. And today, China's clock and watchmaking industry generates about $14 to $15 billion annually in revenue. Not small. And I think, mes amis, we're going to call it an episode right here. I hope you all enjoyed this one. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California, wishing you all a happy and healthy Year of the Dragon. And if it's also a peaceful year, I'm sure none of us would mind. Please set your timepieces and join me next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.